Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything, from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal.
Breaking news, stay at home. That is the order tonight from 4 state governors as the coronavirus pandemic spreads. New York, California, Illinois, and Connecticut all ordering non-essential employees to stay home. Those orders cover 75 million people across the United States. New York's governor today telling non-essential businesses in his state to reduce their workforce to zero.
Today is the final chapter, part 4 of our journey to starting a company and what we learned over the last 18 years and on how to grow, survive recessions, pandemics, personal tragedy, and why we keep plowing along. But that was a newscast from March of 2020 when pretty much everything as we know it changed. Good morning, Dee. How you doing?
Pretty good. It's interesting that we're finally kind of coming around on this storytelling kind of journey, and now we're getting to things that happened relatively recently.
Yeah, absolutely. When you heard that little clip that I played there, what came to mind? Just curious.
Oh man, all of the. I remember that when it first was getting announced, there was like generally a lot of agreement amongst people about like, all right, well, this is a pandemic. We need to take it seriously and all this other stuff. And not too long after that, it became kind of this dividing factor, and feels like some people among us felt like it was an opportunity for them to kind of be these dissenters for no great reason, personally.
Yeah, I mean, I think of that time a little differently. Um, I think we were confused about what was happening, just like the rest of the world. Um, but I remember thinking a lot about our business. See, this is the thing about owning a business that I think is crazy. Is like if I worked at a company, I would just be like, okay, well, I'll just do whatever they say, like work from home, stay home, take a vacation, whatever it is. We're trying to figure this thing out. But owning a business, I went into strategy mode of like, what does this actually mean for us? Like research is 50% of the time is very hands-on, and meaning like you're actually in the room with somebody, or you're, in their home, or you're meeting up with them at coffee shops and things like that. And then the other half of it traditionally was kind of online, connecting with people remotely and stuff. And I remember at the time thinking, okay, we have these clients, they're freaking out and don't know what to do. We have this office, our lease is coming up soon, but I'm usually at that office like 3 days a week, working, focusing, kind of doing my thing. What do we do about that? Um, when they say stay home, does that mean that work is going to come to an end, or are we just taking a quick break? Like I remember there being like lots of questions in my mind about what to do. And you and I thought handled it quite well, considering um, that we didn't know what was going on. So we just kind of said, well, 2 or 3 years before this pandemic began, most of our clients were transitioning to communicating and connecting online anyways. So we were kind of used to just working alone and working independently like most of the time. So it wasn't like a huge shift, but definitely like figuring out what it meant for the business was top of mind during this time.
Yeah, I remember us expecting that things were going to get really slow and there's going to be a quiet time period,
Oh
and we'd
yeah.
have to like it would be like 2008 and the bubble bursting. We would have the massive recession. We would have difficulty bringing income in, but that's really not what happened at all.
No, it's not. But I want to take a second and pause right there, and kind of roll it back about a year and a half, because prior to the pandemic hitting, and I think this is important to talk about when you're building a business and you're thinking through things and stuff. Definitely personal tragedy, right? Like, unfortunately, you had lost your father. I had lost my aunt. We lost 3 other close family members during that time, just from age and medical things and stuff. And it's interesting because like during those times, like you and I, we've been very close friends for a very long time, so we have a lot of respect for one another.
Hmm.
But like you try to give each other the breaks. You try to plow through. But the one thing that's constant, that's really hard to change, is that when you're in the middle of working with the client and you're in the middle of like being paid large sums of money to achieve a large goal, it's very hard to walk away. I feel like when you work at a company, you could say, I have to leave, and someone else kind of steps in. But as a
Hmm.
small business, you don't really have that capability that often. And during those hard times, you have to kind of weave in and out, back and forth, and stay connected and that kind of stuff. And I remember those times being quite challenging. So leading up to the pandemic, I had that in the back of my mind of just like, what do we do if one of us is gone for extended period of time, or both of us have to be gone for an extended period of time. And that's something I think all small business owners think about. But when we hit on the pandemic, right, when you're talking about this, my assumption is it's 2008.
Yeah.
It's just done. Like clients are just going to be like, pause on every single bit of work we're doing, everything. And what we learned from 2008, we're going to have to apply again. And that was, when you're not focusing on your clients, you put all your efforts into focusing in your business. How do you make it better? How do you rebrand? How do you do something different? How do you shift? And those are the times, honestly, when the biggest kind of growth tends to happen. That was my assumption, but that is
Hmm.
not what happened, right?
No, I think during the pandemic was the busiest we've ever been.
Ever. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I remember telling my wife, I was like, I'm going to be in this room working remotely, uh, with clients pretty much all day, every day. Why, she was doing the same thing. My son was doing the remote learning, and we've never been so busy. And so let's talk a little bit about why that was. What was the mindset of our clients at the time, D?
Well, at the time, one of the things that advantaged us is that a lot of our clients were either focused on the home,
Uh-huh.
which wasn't reliant on like people getting out and traveling and being outside of the house. They were benefiting from people being home. So these were things like streaming media, e-commerce, that kind of stuff, which
Hmm.
blew up during this time period because everything was getting ordered online and delivered to their house, and they were streaming more than ever, and all these kinds of things. And then the other side of things was all like e-commerce stuff, or not e-commerce, was enterprise stuff that people needed in order to work from home.
Yep.
So we were just nonstop. Like it was unbelievable. There were times when, as things started to ease up, like, I'd have my girlfriend would be going off and like, I'm going to go for this hike, away from people and stuff. So it's safe. And I'd be like, I can't go. I've got too much work to do. Oh, we thought this was going to be some kind of like slow time period where maybe we'd have a little breathing space, but it was absolutely the opposite.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember at the time we were talking about starting the podcast, right? Because this started
Yeah.
during the pandemic,
We
and
started the podcast because we assumed it was going to be slow. So we are like,
yeah,
well, we'll start the podcast because it'll be a good way, a good activity for us. It'll help us, get the word out a little bit and have these conversations because we will have a little bit of downtime. And it became this kind of thing where like we're trying to squeeze podcasts in between doing things because we just believe in the consistency of getting stuff out there.
we also couldn't go anywhere. So it was
Yeah.
like, okay, well, we're working on our clients all day long, and then sometimes you and I would just do podcasts at night, and then we would post them in the morning, right? And I remember a couple of times we would do like bonus podcasts, all that stuff. Because we had nothing to do. Like we were stuck in the house, and we were seeing our numbers go up, and we were kind of proud of that and excited about that because we were hopefully providing some good information and how we think about things and stuff. But that became like the thing. That became the new creative endeavor. Like in 2008, we decided to invent our own product. We decided to rebrand the company, as we mentioned in part two and part three. Um, but this one was about finally taking our creative endeavors and actually applying them in a way that can educate people and shift toward helping large numbers of people understand how our industry works, what we do, how we do it, and how they can apply it to build better product versus building something and then trying to sell it. And I mean, I've had a tremendous time doing this, fun time doing this. Like I really enjoy talking to everyone. I love that we have, tons and tons of people that listen to our podcast on a regular basis and that kind of stuff. But going back to the moment, it felt like, okay, service clients during the day, podcast at night, do as much as we possibly can and see kind of what happens. But I want to talk about, we won't mention their name, but like a client that we worked with that basically came to us during that time period. And it was like, I need to gather data of people in their homes.
Yeah.
And we were like, okay, because I'm sure no other research groups were out collecting data in the home. And so just like we did when we were testing maps for the first time, and we hired a safety driver and got a car and wired it all up. We had to put our creative hat on and figure out how to get data in the home without us being in the home, without us infecting anybody, so we don't get in trouble.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. It was creative. It was hard. I
We had
remember having to like put rubber gloves on and all this stuff. I mean, it was nuts.
we had multiple different things like that. So we had one where we had to do basically kind of a remote ethnography, where it was like, kind of the observation and kind of understanding their space. And these were with different clients, and they were both like very large, well established, somewhat, kind of iconic Silicon Valley companies. There was one where we had to do that one where we were just kind of like, oh, we're doing remote ethnography. We're understanding their process. We're understanding their environment. We're understanding, what tools and equipment they have, and the things they're doing. And then we had another one, um, at least one that stands out to me. There was a bunch of them in between, but where we had to get people to evaluate a physical hardware product. And
Mm-hmm.
both of those, so we had to be able to get the hardware product in their hand so that they could, feel it, touch it, and all that stuff. So that meant sanitizing it, that meant delivering it and picking it up afterwards because we weren't going in their home. So I remember for that one, these were methodologies that didn't exist. They came to us and they were like, hey, we don't necessarily know how to do this. We need you guys to kind of figure out how this would work. So for both of those, we designed the methodology. We figured out all the logistics for the one hardware one. I remember you were out in the field and delivering stuff and picking things up, or I might pick them up, and then we would like drop it, or even somebody from the client would drop it off, and then we do the interview, and then they'd pick it up and take it to the next house.
Oh man,
So
I remember doing the
like,
interviews outside, and at one point, a client was like, "You can come in my house. Like, I'll leave the windows open." I was like, "I am so sorry, but I cannot do that." I was like, "We have literally a legal contract that says
yeah.
that we'll not step foot in your house."
Yeah,
And like,
so
it was
during that
weird.
time frame, like all of the SOWs we would sign, we had like master service agreements (MSAs) with these clients, and then they would have an additional rider along with the SOW that we signed that said that we will not do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, like all this laundry list of like best practices in order to avoid infection. Which I kind of think it actually worked out for us
Yeah.
more than others. This is a time period also. Remember, when we started off, there was almost nobody. There was no competition for us. We were like, which is kind of good and bad. We we were the only game in town to some extent, not fully, but there were very few other people out there. But by the time the disc rolled around, there were plenty of other researchers out there. But they, for the most part, research companies other than us, they're mostly just going to repeat existing methodologies. They're
Hmm.
the cookie cutter stuff. When our whole brand is built around like, hey, if you need something that's a little bit unique or different, you need to innovate in your methodology because you're innovating in your product. We're the ones to come to, and that's why we're working with all those super secret IP generating labs for a while, because a lot of that stuff required some new methodologies to get in there. For us, we developed these with those first clients, right? We did multiple of those ethno things where we'd set
Hmm.
up cameras in the house.
Yep.
We did I want to say three or four of them through that time period, and then we did multiple of the hardware one also, and then we did some other traditional just IDIs, in-depth interviews stuff with people remotely also, because everybody was spending like crazy because all the demand was crazy high.
Well, think about it, right? We're in a situation where everybody is trying to continue to keep their revenue flowing, all that kind of stuff. But we're in this whole new world, and everybody needs research to tell you what to do. It was like, okay,
Yes.
well, what do I do? Right. And one of the things that we had done before, but this time we had to like even perfect it better, was having customers that were communicating with via Zoom
Hmm.
teach them how to use their cameras to give us walkthroughs of their houses and their bedrooms and their workstations. And that was really fun, right? Like trying to, okay, no, move your camera over here. Now I see this thing on your desk. Why do you use that? How is this being done? Like researchers were pushed to really kind of tell the story about what's happening
Hmm.
and then consolidate that data and bring it together so that basically the consumer facing companies can actually get these products out to people. And
Yeah.
even this small thing that people forget about, getting product. So we had to order a bunch of product in order to pull off these research endeavors. And we would order stuff, and then some stuff would be like, nope, delayed 3 weeks, or not going to show up, or,
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
sitting on a boat off the coast of Long Beach.
yeah, and we couldn't get it, right? So we were like, okay, how do we work around this? I remember I used some things I had in the office that were older, and I was like, I'll just use all these
Hmm.
old cables, or, I'll use these rubber gloves that I was able to get from my neighbor. Like, oh man, like we had to make things work, and it was an interesting time. The thing is like it was exciting, but it also
Hmm.
created this question in my mind of like, well, if all of these companies are seeing the value of all this work being done remotely like this, maybe they won't want to do a lot of in-person stuff after this thing cools off. I remember thinking that at the time, and that has definitely come true. There's definitely a love for, and you get a lot of data from it, doing remote research rather than
Yeah,
doing in person. I mean, here's a great example for everyone to kind of hear. If your budget, let's say, can handle sending two researchers to three different states to meet with three individuals in each state, that's, let's say, 9 people, and to tell a story about those three states, that means your budget can handle remote work in almost every state across the country, because you could just connect with a different state every single day. So it made sense from a geographical standpoint to try to get a broader range of individuals on a call than it
yeah,
was to just like, hey, D, can you fly to Oregon, meet with this family on a farm, talk to them about how they use their products, and fly back home? It's expensive.
yeah. That's one of the biggest advantages of doing this research remotely is you can get people from all across the country. You can get people in Canada. You can get people in the UK, Australia. I mean, I'm mentioning mostly the English speaking countries because you typically do kind of want to stick to whatever the natural language is of your moderator.
Yeah.
But like you can get somebody in, and we've done this before. We can get somebody kind of in a small rural town in Georgia, and then somebody else in somewhere in Idaho, and then get somebody in New York City and Chicago. And in order to get that breadth of people through in person work, would be prohibitively expensive. Like it's
Yeah.
one thing to go like get somebody who's 10 miles from an international airport somewhere else to get somebody who's like a 2 hour drive from it
Mhm.
from a major airport.
Yeah. I remember one user in particular that I really liked, which I'll share with everybody, is she was a vendor inside of a flea market that's inside
Hmm.
of like a building in Georgia. And I remember thinking that was like the coolest interview, because she was sitting inside of her vendor booth inside of a flea market telling me how she's using her technology to make sales. And this particular flea market spot that she has, and the products that she sells there, is what feeds her family and runs her life. And it was like, I remember thinking in my mind, like, oh my God, this is so different than my life. Like, I love this. Like she was so great. And I vividly remember it just because I could see all the all the stuff hanging behind her that's for sale in her flea market booth. And it's just like you get such interesting experiences when you have the opportunity to talk with people, remotely
Yeah.
outside of your area.
And it's one of the biggest advantages of this job is you just learn so much about people, how different people from across the country, from around the world, how they live, what they think, what they feel, how ways in which they're all the same, and little ways in which there might be a little bit different.
Yeah, excuse me, I'm yawning. Uh, the other thing I would say about that too is that when you're in this field, especially for a really long time, I find that people will say to me like, "Well, I wonder why this is happening or that's happening," and I kind of always have an answer. Like I'm like, "Well,
Yeah,
that's because people in that region tend to use this way, this way." Like I just instinctually know all that stuff because of the fact
yeah,
that we have talked with so many people.
and even if you don't know, you usually have a pretty good idea of why it might be. You can come up with
Absolutely.
hypotheses pretty well.
Yeah, it's weird. You see the world in such an interesting way. It's not like just looking at numbers and data and saying like, "Oh, this is where the trend is heading." It's like, "Oh, I remember talking to Jane over in Oregon,
Yeah,
and she told me that the only reason why she buys this type of thing is because on the farm it's really dirty and blah blah." And it's like your brain has so much like contextual human knowledge in it, and that kind of leads to our next point, which is like I think you and I kind of realized during that time, we've been at this business for 18 years now. And I think we kind of realized at that time it was time to start moving into education more. And I don't mean like
yeah,
D and I are now teaching at the university, which we could, but like it's more that we want to educate our clients and the people who work with us so they can go off and continue to meet these people and do this work themselves and be empowered by this work. And it doesn't affect our business because we're just basically being paid to do something slightly different, which is we do some of the work, but a lot of the times we're also trying to elevate the level of education internally about like how to go out and figure out what's going on in the world. And it's been tremendously like powerful for me and impactful for me just to be able to see that I can kind of push in that direction. It also makes me feel old a little bit because I didn't think about doing this 12 years ago. I thought about doing it after 18 years in business.
Well, it's kind of been a part of what we do for quite a while. Like for many years, we've been, we brought in, work on our project, and they'd have some very junior person shadowing us and observing what we're doing, and that was largely for them to learn the job to some extent. And that happened through kind of the major client work that we mentioned before, where, we were innovating the new methods, and then they'd have somebody kind of, on their side observing us and learning from that. And then they'd bring us back in and repeat that method with, a different product or something. And you'd have new people kind of observing us. They can go on and then replicate what we had done on their own. But I think this actually kind of started before the pandemic. So we had already kind of started. We had a somebody came to us and said, "Hey, we want to be able to bring kind of these UX and research methodologies into our company more, and we need people who can help educate us." And you were recommended by people who we trust. So that actually got in place before the pandemic started. And we thought to ourselves, hey, this is kind of cool. Maybe because we're expecting this downturn, we'll launch the podcast. We'll kind of reorient a little bit more towards education. We've kind of done that, but not nearly as much as we had expected to, just because we got so busy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we, I struggle with this because it's like we have so much knowledge in our head and we want to get it out to everybody, but it almost requires someone to like interview us or push us from a project perspective to unlock it, because there are things sometimes you'll remind me and I'll go, oh, I completely forgot that we did it that way. Or I completely forgot that was a way to solve this problem, whatever it is. It's just because we've done it so many times, or we assume that everybody thinks about it in that way. And I often think to myself, like, as we move forward and we provide more education, how do we go about unlocking all those 18 years of secrets and ways in order to achieve goals smoother and easier or more streamlined, um, and get that out of my head so that it provides value to people. And this has helped a lot. This podcast has helped a lot.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things for me when it comes to to the education stuff is like developing like an actual structured curriculum. Like, all right, well, you start with this and you understand this, and then you move to that, and you understand that, and you move to that. It's really difficult to figure out where to start. And I mean, ultimately, you probably should start with users. I think this is a time where this will be kind of moving into a new season of the podcast, and I think we'll kind of rededicate ourselves a little bit in order to generating more educational content for people to understand kind of the craft of the research and how that ties into the design of the products, as well as the marketing and all those other things. But it was interesting that throughout the pandemic, we've been working with this company that had brought us in, and we've been kind of mentoring not just the people who will be doing the research, but also the people who are going to be consuming the outcome. And there are plenty of times when they got some data back and they were looking at it and they're like, this is what it means, and we would come in and say like, well, actually, what I would not jump to that conclusion, and here's the reason why. We would come and we would explain to them, right, well, this is a way that we would interpret this data, and that made a huge difference. So there are so many things going on here in order to kind of get the research into not just an individual who's going to be doing the research, but into the organization so that it's effectively used
Mhm.
and understood. And that actually needs to come from leadership first, in a way.
Well, and we learned as well because, as we would go and bring data or insights to C-level executives, which we do a lot now, is that they sometimes some of them would be super interested in the data, and they would say like, "I
Mhm.
love what you're seeing here, what you're doing here. Like that sounds interesting, blah blah." And they want to hear the whole story. And then some of them, rightfully, because they're busy and they have other things going on, are like, what do I do? Like, what should I do? You understand the data, you've seen it. Like, what do I do with this data? How do I apply it? And so we really weaved in a lot of the application stuff of just like, I'm not just going to tell you what's happening. I'm going to tell you what we think you should do. And a lot of researchers don't want to do that. But every other industry does that. Whether you're a
Yeah.
marketer, you're a data scientist, you're an engineer, everyone has an opinion and says, I think you should do X, Y, and Z based on what I'm seeing. But researchers tend to stand back a little bit, or at least traditionally have, and just said, like, here's the data, here's which way things are going, you make your decision. And D and I, we're not doing that. Like, we're going to tell you what we think. We're going to say, hey, based on this data, we think you should do X, Y, and Z. And
Mhm.
you can do whatever you want, but like, we just want you to know, based on our history and our experience, this is kind of the direction we think you should take things. And the challenging part, honestly, of that, from an education standpoint, is that if they don't take your kind of opinions and things don't go well, then there's this weird uncomfortableness of like, okay, well, how do we communicate with one another? And then if they do take your opinions and things go well, then they almost rely on you to tell you what to do, and are less interested in looking at the details, meaning the data. So D and I are always in a position of like trying to give some data, some suggestions, full data, some
Yeah.
suggestions. We're shifting all the time.
So I think from a strategic standpoint for the work that we do, you kind of have to come in and say, okay, well, here is my best case scenario. This is what you should do. And, that can range from like, what, you're doing great. Keep doing what you're doing. Just make sure you don't change in these particular ways, because if you do, then it can cause problems. So that's all the, identifying potentials for something that's going great to becoming something that's not going as great. On the other side of things, it can be like, hey, look, this is really underperforming. Here are the reasons why. Here's what you need to do, and that could include massive investments and things like that. When you make those recommendations, you kind of have to have in mind like, hey, they may not want to do this, so you kind of have to have a plan B for your recommendations, as far as like,
Mm-hmm.
all right, well, you need to relaunch this entire product, you need to rebuild it from the ground up. Okay, if you don't want to do that, here's what you can do instead. And if you don't want to do that, here is what you can do, like working within the constraints. Like, here's your blue sky. You can do it anything you want. Here's what I think you should do. And they should become aware of that, even if they're not going to do it, if you know that ahead of time. And you can just couch it in a phrase like, hey, if this was up to me and I had unlimited resources, this is what I do. Given your constraints and that you're only have these options, here are things that you can do. If you're limited in what you can do to transform the product, here's what you can do from a messaging standpoint to make people understand that, like, okay, hey, we're limited in a certain way, maybe, or we're trying, we care. The most important thing is that you're aware of the issue and that you care, but you don't have a magic wand.
Yeah.
So there comes down to like identifying the issues, how people are going to respond to it. If you can fix it, fix it. If you can't, then sometimes you think of countermeasures. Sometimes you compensate, you provide some other compensation. Maybe it's like they're not happy with this flow, but they're okay with it because we gave them something else. Maybe it's a different use case. Maybe it's something else. So they're willing to overlook the deficiencies in one area because they're making up for it in another area. And
One of the
that kind of
things,
balance is important.
well, that's the thing, right? Is like, that's not classically trained though when you become a researcher.
No.
Like, what you're talking about is basically understanding strategy of delivery of data, of like, how do you go about ensuring you understand your audience before you actually deliver the data, and then help implement like methods and things like that for them to understand it and then apply it. And for me personally, like, I feel like that's just been time on task, meaning like years and years and years and years and years of like delivering data, seeing how people respond, asking them what they
Yeah.
liked and didn't like, how it worked. I mean, we first started the business and we were working with clients. I mean, I know that kind of UX research was kind of new, but like, we would just deliver the outcome, right? We'd say, here's what
Mhm.
happened, and leave it up to the product manager or someone else to kind of interpret it. And every so often they'd ask, like, what do you think? But for the most part, they did. And they were just like, thanks for the data, we're moving on, which is kind of like when you get data from like McKinsey or somebody, and, and they say, we analyze, remote work across the entire world, and here's the data set. they're not really telling you exactly what to do with the data set. They don't know your business. They're just giving you the data set. Now you have to figure that out.
Yeah.
And I'd like to see UX move into a more mentorship role of here's the data. Now I'm going to mentor you through the process of implementing this to ensure that we have a good outcome. Now, there are
Yeah.
people that are going to challenge us. Either people are like, we don't need that. Like, I have great ideas and you don't need to do research. You don't need to test anything. But that's a small minority these days. And that minority is maybe the people who are not interested in having someone turn on their car and test it out after they just put on new brakes. Like, I have no idea, but like anytime you're making an investment into a product or something, my assumption is that you should test it and make sure that it works with your customer and your audience. Um,
Yeah.
but that's becoming more of a minority. That was less of a minority early on, but now it's becoming more of a minority.
I kind of think of it like you're like if you were doing some kind of carpentry or woodwork or any other kind of like uh, work with tools, and you're doing it without like any kind of measurements, without a tape ruler or calipers or anything like that. You can do it. You can go out there and you can build a table without measuring anything. You say that, like to say, measure twice, cut once. You can do it without that, but you don't have to if you don't want to. And that's kind of where we come in, is that we provide that measurement thing so you can measure twice, cut once. Now, I think our everything that we've been talking about how we're providing the data and how we're thinking about the data, comes from ultimately deeply understanding the users, and developing that kind of understanding over the years of like even coming down to like the level of reliability of responses to an individual question. We can tell when looking at a survey, this one's going to be really reliable because people have clear opinions about it, and they're not afraid to say it. This one's not going to be very reliable because people are a little bit shy about answering this question. They're uncomfortable about it for whatever reason. It
Uh-huh.
might be too personal. It might be that they don't want to admit what they think, those kinds of things. So that's ones where you might be a little bit more cautious. But on the other side of things, it's also understanding our users, our consumers of our work, which is our clients, and the kind of thought processes they have to go through, what they have to think about, like them as human beings and trying to accomplish certain goals and understanding their constraints. So that's us looking at them and saying, let's make it easy for them, both in figuring out what to do, but also kind of understanding they might have to balance a bunch of different competing needs, costs, or what other people want
Mm-hmm.
within the company, or whatever that might be, or the internal politics. Let's give them the proper options so they can choose from these, because they're the ones who have to choose and make the decisions. What would work best for them, and trying to find something that they can look at and say, like, I hear what you're saying about this big change and a very expensive thing. Can't do that, but this other option that you provided, that looks like it would work great, and
Yeah.
that makes people really feel safe and comfortable working with you.
I think it's sometimes hard to compromise on data that comes directly from the users when they're unhappy, right?
Yeah,
And I've had to learn to plow through this myself because I had a C-level executive tell me one time, like, you're giving me this suggestion of what to do, but what to do requires me to basically start all over again, and we just don't have the funds to do so. So, is there a way to kind of push through this but not start all over, meet in the middle? The answer always is yes. It's just I always want to deliver, like, what would you do if it was a perfect world? Right?
yeah,
If it was a perfect world and you had all the money in the world, what would you do? You'd start over because they're not happy with X, Y, and Z, right? If it's not a perfect world, then you can make these cuts, these adjustments, and satisfy them for the time being. But ultimately, you should know that what they really want is they want you to start over. And those have been hard conversations. And those have been hard for me because sometimes I just say, like, hey, if you don't have a capability of making the best product, you're just not going to get the outcome you're looking for. Right. And it bums me out. And so I have I've had to work through those and learn how to communicate better about those and basically say, like, hey, like, this is how it's going to be, but we're still going to stick with you. We're still going to help you. We're not like running away because you're not going to take our suggestions. We're going to find new methods and new ways to figure out how to get through this. But we do ultimately need to know this is kind of what's really on the docket for change in the future, and it's going to cost. probably a lot, right?
Yeah,
And
but
so it
and to
happens
be
all the
fair,
time.
the the like start over from scratch things doesn't really happen that often. It does happen,
No, no.
and it like it feels like it happens more often than this because it's really salient, but it doesn't really. The majority of times, it's like, all right, you're doing okay. You can implement A, B, and C and do 40% better, or you can implement just A and do 10% better. And maybe A, B, and C is going to be too expensive. You can do just A, but keep in mind you're leaving 30% on the table.
Yeah, exactly. And you love doing that where you're kind of giving them percentages so they can kind of like wrap their head around it. Because that's one thing I will say is really important to understand that just showing someone numbers is not going to work because everybody learns differently and everyone's been trained differently. So
Hmm.
you actually have to go in and think of different ways to communicate about things, whether it be analogies or, like you said, going with percentages for some people, or for some people it's like, the business will fail if you don't do X, or
Yeah.
whatever language you have to use or whatever ways you have to get it across, you have to do it. And in some cases, and we recommend this all the time, you just have to show video of the customer saying
Yeah.
what they want, and it will change everyone's opinion. It's like watching a movie, right? You watch a movie and you kind of never forget it. You sit around in a textbook and study something and you remember 50% of it, right? And so we try to show movies sometimes of customers saying, hey, this is where I'm struggling. This is what I want. I really wanted to do X, Y, and Z, but I can't seem to do it. And it really cements in the message. And so that's part of the education part. And that's part of what you were telling me earlier. We were talking about next season, right? Is that we're going to do another 4 to 6 part series next season on how to build a product. And basically, from the perspective of people who like to use research and data to tell a story, to make sure that the customer's following you along the entire journey, that they are center to it. I mean, back in the day, they used to call it user-centered design. I don't know if they still do. I think that's kind of an older term now, but just putting the user in the center and then designing around them to make sure that they're always part of the process. And do you want to talk a little bit about some of the just general ideas you had for that series next season?
Well, we're kind of looking at like some of the processes that we've taken. So the reality is there are many, many different ways in order to kind of develop a product. We're going to talk about, I think, some of the ways that we have found that have worked best for us. And that is kind of starting with one of two approaches. Either you start with, I want to build a product for these people because I think that they're underserved or there's some opportunity there, or maybe I just like really like this group of people, or I understand them, or I'm one of them. We want to understand where their needs are and try to come up with something that's going to be helpful for them. And then on the other side of things is where you come up with an idea of like, oh hey, wouldn't it be great? I was off doing this thing and I realized like, oh, I had to do this ridiculous thing in order to accomplish this task. Wouldn't it be great if I had this thing that could do this for me?
Yeah.
So that's where you go out and determine like, all right, well, who is that for? Who will be buying that? How are they making their needs met now? How can we is this a standalone product or is this a feature that goes into another product, that kind of thing, and then working through from there, going into kind of the different elements of design, and from the boxes and arrows to the wireframes to the design specs, and then from there going on to like working with engineering in order to get that stuff done, and all of the testing and data analysis and data collection and analysis that goes on between in order to make sure you're on the right track, or in order to support the right design decisions that you need to make. And we'll probably, I think, take it all the way to figuring out what are the marketing strategies, what are the distribution channels, and all those things that are associated with it, because that's all extremely important. And we've seen great products fail because there wasn't a great distribution channel that they could come up with, or it wasn't marketed correctly, and or even the nature of the product wasn't clearly communicated. That's how we find that most new innovative products fail right out of the gate, is that there is no precedent for what it is. So users are confused when they come across it, and the messaging isn't clear about like, what is this? What is it for? In like very simple declarative statements.
Yeah.
So those are all things that we'll probably want to talk about, and like even not just what we do, but the sequences of steps that kind of happen.
Yeah, and I think that's key, especially if you're building a business. As people listen to it, I think they're going to want to understand the sequence and the steps and the decisions that are made. And in addition to that, we'll tell some stories. We'll kind of highlight
Mhm.
everything with stories so that you can understand how we applied it when it succeeded and also when it failed for sure. Um, I also want to take a minute before we wrap up this podcast today and talk about like kind of what things look like after 2020. So, from our perspective, things have kind of gone uh, somewhere in the middle. Like, so 2020 and 2021 were very busy in the sense that, you know, a lot of remote work, that kind of stuff happening. We are now, as we're 2022, 2023, right? We're now seeing things slightly go back to a little bit like it was before. But for the most part, I think people learning that remote research is kind of a big a big component of their business. A lot of the work that we're doing seems to be digital work right now, seems to be less physical stuff. And that is just the nature of Silicon Valley because we have years where it's just all physical all the time. And then suddenly it switches over to digital. And now it's like mostly digital. Um,
Hmm.
and still a lot of experiences that are driven by being at home or by
Uh,
being
yeah,
remote, right?
I think that's actually partially driven by the technology that's emerging at this point in time,
Yeah.
which is this new generation of AI. So I think for a while you're going to see kind of this digital AI deliveries, like these chatbots or digital assistants, stuff like that. And
Uh-huh.
then at some point we're going to see more AI enabled hardware that are going to be in the home, outside of the home. Things like, the classic example is your Roomba, right? It's using AI in order to kind of track like where things are in the house and responding to the environment in order to clean. I think we're going to see after this round of kind of digital focused product, they're going to shift back to AI in physical products again sometime in the years to come.
Yeah, I think so too. It's interesting because I just watched the release of the new GoPro Hero 12.
Mm,
And I think about like when we worked with GoPro, which was like 2014, it was a long time ago now. Um, is that how far like they've come? Everything they talk about is software, right? It's like software stabilization, software, it's like all AI driven software applications helping you have a greater experience within the package of hardware. And I think what you're talking about is a lot of that happening, right? Like I have heard about iRobot and their
mhm.
team and the intelligence that they're putting into their chips and things like that. I think it's just like it could be a whole decade of
Yeah,
implementation of that level of thinking inside of hardware. And when you do that, you need researchers because interacting average people interacting with hardware and robots and all those fun things, it requires a tremendous amount of understanding of how people live. And so I think
yeah,
we're going to see a lot of that happening, and that'll be super exciting. I mean, I like that stuff a lot. If I could physically touch it and play with it and stuff like that, I feel like I definitely my brain wraps its head around possibilities better than when I don't have that opportunity.
yeah.
Like it takes more work on my part to kind of like really explore and play with something when it's not tactile.
Yeah, this is going to be my prediction for the future. There was a time period where we had all these so-called smart appliances going out,
Yep.
and at the time they weren't really smart. They were just connected. I
Yep.
think we will eventually see the real smart appliances coming along, and that could be like a washing machine, for example, that doesn't just like you don't just load the your scoops of detergent in and stain remover or whatever and let it run. It actually monitors the cleanliness of the clothing. It actually has like reservoirs, detergent, stain lifter, and fabric softener, and it applies those as needed. So you fill a bin that's built into the thing, and it says, okay, I need this much detergent, I need this much stain lifter, and so on and so forth. And it does it intelligently by monitoring the cleanliness of the clothing. And then you'll see smart ovens that are tracking how done the food is and letting
Hmm.
you know and
Yeah.
turning and adjusting temperature. Like, oh, okay, I want it crispy, so I'm going to turn it up. I want it tender, so I'm going to turn it down. And it will do these things on its own.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of those ovens and things like that. Just as a side note, that have cameras in them now. They're monitoring,
Hmm.
like you said, like the level of crisp on the top and everything. It's amazing how things are coming along. The next decade of hardware is going to look way different than it did in the previous decade, and I
Oh
think
yeah.
that's super exciting. But I think this is a wrap. I think this is a good kind of end to both our 4-part series, and I hope it was really, really useful and helpful for people to understand like how we built our business, what it looked like, the ups and downs and all arounds, and just how exciting but messy and crazy things can really get. And this is also the end of this series. We went over again. We were going to try to do like 10 episodes per season. But sometimes we get excited and we do like 10, 12, 13, 14. I think one time we did like 17. But we're going to wrap today. We're going to take a little bit of a break. We're going to start building our outlines and stuff for our 4 to 6 part series that we're going to do next season. And also think about what are the things that we want to talk about and who do we want to bring on the podcast. So thank you all for listening. We really appreciate it. We hope you share this with everybody. We want to keep growing. We love doing this. We don't get paid to do it yet, but we hope one day that we will. So everyone, thank you again. Thank you for a wonderful season. And we will see you all in maybe a month or so. All right. Talk to you soon.